Good afternoon. I'm Susie Saavedra, Senior Director for Policy and Legislative Affairs with the National Urban League's Washington Bureau, and I'm joined by my colleague Sri Chauhan, Senior Manager of Education and Health Policy. On behalf of Mark Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League, and Donald Cravens Jr., Executive Director of the National Urban League's Washington Bureau, we want to welcome you to our first webinar on the Every Student Succeeds Act, also known as Essa, which passed last December. This is the first in a series of webinars we will be hosting about Essa, and we hope you'll be able to join us for all of them. Today, we'll be providing a general overview of the law. For next week's webinar, we'll provide you with more information about state and local advocacy as it relates to the law. Our final webinar on March 22nd will focus on funding opportunities in Essa.
By the end of today's session, you will be able to understand the new law, how it relates to the National Urban League mission, and how our advocacy continues as Essa is rolled out in the states. We will be taking your questions live at the end of our webinar. You can submit them by email or via our Twitter handle @NULPolicy. Please be sure to include your name and affiliate in your email.
Throughout this webinar, we will be referring to the many names of this law. The original legislation passed by Congress is known as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, better known as ESEA. The last reauthorized version of this law, signed by President George W. Bush, is the No Child Left Behind Act, also known as NCLB. And the current iteration of the law, which was signed by President Barack Obama, is the Every Student Succeeds Act. This is our nation's chief K-12 civil rights law and one of the legislative tools that helps the National Urban League reach its education empowerment goal, which is to ensure every child is prepared for college, work, and life.
For our affiliate movement, Essa represents an opportunity to build upon the work you are already doing, elevate your affiliate's advocacy priorities to state and local leaders, and potentially receive funding to support and grow your education services within your community. As was the case with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, known as WIOA, affiliates must be engaged in the implementation process in order to take advantage of opportunities within Essa.
The reauthorization of this law is 8 years overdue. As a result of this delay, in 2012, the U.S. Department of Education stepped in to offer states some relief from the stringent accountability interventions in the previous version of the law. This stopgap, known as ESEA waivers, provided more autonomy to states. Unfortunately, in Essa, Congress doubled down on this idea and provided states even more autonomy, which will require stakeholders to be even more vigilant in ensuring that the new law is implemented equitably.
From the beginning of the Essa negotiation process, we were fighting an uphill battle. At first, both the House and Senate passed versions of the law that did not include our civil rights priorities, and in several disconcerting ways, actually eroded key protections for vulnerable students.
While this certainly wasn't the bill we would have written, we were able to increase resource equity and data transparency. We held the ground on accountability, but lost some ground on the strength of the federal role in the law. We also won some Urban League-specific priorities, including a new $250 million grant to expand preschool and increase funding for STEM education.
The wins wouldn't have been possible without the steadfast advocacy of our affiliates. 44 affiliates from 21 states engage in advocacy, from reaching out directly to their member of Congress to spreading the word on social media. Thank you.
Now that Essa is the law of the land, the Obama administration is eager to move to implementation. So now we're going to use the next few minutes to share the key deadlines at the federal and state levels and how these timelines will affect your engagement.
At the federal level, with your input, the National Urban League submitted pre-regulation recommendations in January. As you may know, these regulations will provide states with important guidance on how to implement the law. It is our goal to ensure that the regulations will support the equitable implementation of the law. Last month, the Department of Education kicked off the official regulatory process. As part of this notice, the department has asked for recommendations for candidates to serve as negotiators by February 25th.
And once negotiators are selected by the department, they'll meet in Washington, D.C. in March and April and write the first draft of regulations. Once the first draft of the regulations are written, the public, including the National Urban League, will then have the opportunity to provide our input in the summer. The department will then incorporate public comments and issue final regulations before the November elections.
States are beginning to gear up for implementation as well. While the timelines will vary, we expect states to start developing their Essa implementation plans from now through this summer. There are a couple of other deadlines that are important for states.
First, formula funds from Essa will be dispersed this July, and competitive funds will be dispersed in October. In our third webinar on March 22nd, we will provide you with more detail about the funding opportunities in the law.
Second, ESEA waivers will expire in October, and new state accountability systems, as governed by each state, will go into effect in the 2017-2018 school year.
The National Urban League will weigh in on the regulatory process. We will be asking for your feedback via our Education Task Force this month and in the summer. Because of the changes in federal oversight, it's critical that you engage in the implementation process at the state and local levels as soon as possible.
We want you to have a seat at the table during every step of this process. That's why you should begin requesting meetings with your governor, your state education leaders, and your district education leaders. These individuals should include agency officials, communications officials, along with state and local boards. You should also meet with district officials overseeing Essa programs for which you'd like to secure funding.
As you convene local partners and stakeholders, use that time to identify and advocate for your collective priorities as it relates to your state plans and your stakeholder engagement plans. In our webinar next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be providing you with more information on what should be included in these plans.
You're not alone in this work. The Washington Bureau will be providing all affiliates with template letters you can use with your state and local leaders. This month and next month, we will make ourselves available to affiliate CEOs and provide one-on-one sessions to develop your advocacy plans. We will also email you a link after this webinar so you can sign up for a session.
And as we mentioned, we will also be hosting 2 more webinars on Essa. During our webinar next Thursday, we'll go deeper on state and local advocacy. And for our last webinar on Tuesday, March 22nd, we'll explain how to take advantage of the numerous funding opportunities available to Urban League affiliates in the new law.
Essa will go into full effect beginning in August 2016, and there are some major differences between the No Child Left Behind Act and Essa. Understanding these differences will help you develop your state and local advocacy strategy.
The No Child Left Behind Act, which the Every Student Succeeds Act replaced, had a much stronger role for the federal government. Federal oversight is a priority for the National Urban League in education and across most issue areas because states have not always been strong stewards of civil rights. Now, for the most part, states, districts, and communities are the ones holding states accountable to achieving the goals outlined in Essa.
Under NCLB, the federal government set a goal of 100% proficiency on assessments for all students by the 2014-15 school year. If schools did not make sufficient annual progress toward these goals for all students and for specific subgroups like African American students, then the schools were subject to automatic interventions.
Under Essa, the responsibility to set proficiency goals and the timelines to meet them has shifted back to the states. States will also get to approve what kind of interventions and supports they will be provided and when they should be provided. We are concerned that this added flexibility could result in states masking the performance of struggling students in order to avoid providing additional resources and interventions. Now we're going to go into a little more detail about the accountability systems and how they will differ from NCLB.
Unlike in NCLB, when the federal government set an overall 100% proficiency goal by 2014, states will now have the opportunity to set long-term student achievement goals. interim progress goals, and timelines to achieve those goals. These goals will be set in each state plan, which is why your engagement with state officials is critical.
For Essa, accountability systems will now be made up of 4 indicators and will allow states latitude on how each indicator is weighted. For elementary and middle schools, state accountability systems will have to include, number 1, standardized test scores, 2, student growth or another indicator that can be meaningfully differentiated, 3, English language proficiency, 4, an indicator of school quality or success that can be meaningfully differentiated among student groups. High school accountability will include the same indicators, except that student growth, the second indicator I just mentioned, will be replaced by graduation rates.
Under NCLB, the accountability system just consisted of standardized assessments and one other indicator at the elementary and middle school levels. High schools were measured by assessments and graduation rates.
Now, using their accountability system, states will identify schools that are the lowest performing 5% and any high school with a graduation rate at or below 67%. They will identify schools at least once every 3 years. Additionally, every year, states will also identify any school with a subgroup of students that is consistently underperforming based on all indicators in the state accountability system. It's important to note that states will define what the term consistently underperforming means. In our second webinar, we'll provide you with guidance on how this term should be defined.
Under NCLB, any school that missed its performance target for any subgroup for 2 or more consecutive years was identified for intervention.
However, intervention is not uniform under this version of the law and relies a great deal on community engagement, both to assess the needs of schools and to choose interventions. Once identified, the following schools will receive interventions under Essa: the lowest performing 5% of schools, as well as high schools with graduation rates at or below 67%. These schools must allow for public school choice and apply comprehensive, locally determined, evidence-based interventions.
Additionally, states are required to identify a second subset of schools for interventions. These schools will be identified if they have subgroups performing at the same level as the bottom 5% of schools in their states. Such schools must apply an evidence-based, locally determined, targeted intervention. They must also identify and address resource inequities in their school improvement plans. Should these subgroup schools fail to improve within a state-set period of time, they will then receive comprehensive, locally determined, evidence-based interventions. Both comprehensive and targeted interventions will be determined at the local level with school and community input. The timelines are different for the schools receiving comprehensive interventions and targeted interventions. Susie will explain that next.
So under NCLB, schools had to meet increasingly rigorous targets or apply interventions that escalate every year. Under Essa, comprehensive support schools have 4 years to meet state-set criteria to exit this status. If these schools don't improve, they must implement more rigorous state-determined interventions, which may include changes in school-level operations, such as school closure, or becoming a charter school. Targeted support schools must reach state-set exit criteria by a state-set time period, or the school will be identified for comprehensive support.
That wraps up our explanation of the new law, and now we're going to open it up for questions.
Any questions? So I think we just got one question right here. I'm gonna ask, does Essa require supports to all schools or just struggling schools?
So Essa requires supports and interventions for a specific subset of schools. Susie and I mentioned those schools earlier. The bottom 5% of schools, high schools that have graduation rates at or below 67%, and finally, a subset of schools where subgroups of students are performing at the same level as the bottom 5% of schools.
And then one more question, and I think I can take this one. Does the law require states to adopt the Common Core state standards? So the law does not specifically mention the words Common Core state standards or requirement to adopt these standards. What it does say, however, is that states must adopt college and career-ready standards that prepare all students to graduate, prepare students to be ready for college, work, and life. And I don't know the exact terminology, but there is that requirement that students graduate college ready.
So we have one more question here. So what information will have to be on school report cards according to the law? Susie, do you want to take that one?
So the law doesn't necessarily prescribe specific parameters for individual student report cards, but it does have clear requirements for district and state level report cards. I think that kind of covers it.
Yeah, and they're very specific within the law regarding what those parameters are, and it should be publicly disseminated, that information.
Okay, I think that wraps up our questions, at least the ones that we've received. So there's a lot of work to be done on ESSA and many opportunities for the Urban League movement to engage. As we wrap up, we'd like to leave you with these next steps.
1. Set up meetings with state and local officials.
2. Begin convening your local partners, community members, parents, civic and faith-based leaders, and the education coalitions you work with to establish priorities on your ESSA advocacy.
3. Schedule one-on-one time with the Washington Bureau team for personalized ESSA advocacy support.
And finally, join our upcoming webinars to learn about state and local engagement and funding opportunities in ESSA.
Thanks again to the Alliance for Excellent Education for hosting us today, and a sincere thanks to all of you for joining our webinar. See you next week.